for inviting me here as well. It's really exciting, the Auckland Critical Theory Network, and really awesome to be able to come up and talk through some things that have been kind of close to my heart and kind of knocking around in my head for a while. And thanks to Simon as well for organising everything. As Campbell mentioned, I'm the current editor of Counterfutures and a PhD student at Vic, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about leftist kind of publishing broadly in this country, and I guess what I see as some kind of like challenges and prospects going forward. And I also want to just kind of indulge in a admittedly slightly sketchy kind of critical theory gloss of some kind of concepts around left publishing. So I won't talk too much about Counterfutures specifically, because I kind of want to do a bit of a wider stock-taking exercise, but I'll draw a little bit on some of the kind of like things we've learnt in publishing the journal. In particular, I want to talk about the potential role I see of left publishing as a kind of institution or contribution towards the development of counter-hegemonic infrastructure, which I'm sure will not be a new concept to any of you. And also in the kind of, the development of the wider communist project. So I want to cover kind of three main points. First, I want to kind of sketch out some of the kind of, broad historical coordinates of the present and introduce the idea that I'm sure will not be new to people about that the current period is characteristic of an interregnum, what Antonio Gramsci called an interregnum. And as such, is a kind of an opportunity for the left to kind of really assert itself in the struggle for hegemony. But I want to also emphasise that I think it's important to remember that an interregnum is an extremely kind of ambiguous political state, and so while many on the left are quite excited about the potential that the current moment offers, there's also kind of nothing inherent in the current moment that means the left will emerge better off. Or that capitalism itself is in critical danger. And the final analysis in this respect kind of will only be able to be made retrospectively. And so, second point, with this in mind, I kind of want to highlight the importance of taking a longer view of communist struggle and to suggest that a crucial element in engendering and kind of supporting this longer view of communism is the development of counter-hegemonic infrastructure. And in that, left publishing fulfills, in my view, a number of roles. And so thirdly, I want to highlight some of the roles that I see left publishing contributing to the kind of development of counter-hegemonic infrastructure in the present moment, and in particular in engendering a kind of longer view of the communist project. And then to conclude, I'll kind of outline a couple of kind of lessons from Counterfutures, or and what I see as kind of major tasks immediately and in the kind of near future. So that's what I want to talk about, but first I thought it would be paid to briefly introduce Counterfutures a bit more. Campbell's given a very flattering introduction to give you a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from. So Counterfutures is a biannual journal of and for the left in Aotearoa, and it published its first issue in early 2016, and will be publishing issue 7 in early June this year. And so the founding editorial board members, and I was not one of them, I came to the project in 2017, wanted to provide a space in which a kind of range of voices and positions from across the radical left, broadly conceived, could be brought into productive conversation with one another, and to provide a platform for the kind of regeneration of the left in this country that has kind of been emerging out of a period of kind of relative quiescence during the neoliberal era. So it's an academic journal in the sense that it publishes peer-review research articles, but it also kind of seeks to go beyond the confines of the academy and engage a broader readership. And part of that project is to kind of publish a diverse range of writers, from not just people from the academy, but people from the activist and union sector and the social movement sector. And kind of also to try and publish a range of forms, so not just research articles, but also political polemics, opinion pieces, and interviews and such. And also putting a kind of emphasis on approachability. So we print the journal at Rebel Press, which is this, located in this pokey little office and trades hall building in Wellington on Vivian Street, which I'd highly encourage you to get in touch with if you want to kind of pursue small kind of print runs, less than kind of two or 300. Rebel Press was started in 2007 by some anarchist comrades, and today is kind of full of all the slightly antiquated machinery you need to print and bind your own books. And so when the journal's ready for print, 3 or 4 of us will spend some time there kind of printing, binding, guillotining it. And so we make the journal free online, but stagger the release of each issue's content over a 6-month period to try and incentivise some purchases and subscriptions, because we need the money to print it. So for my part, I started with the journal in 2017, just started helping out down at Rebel Press, binding and printing, and then I started doing some editorial work for issues 3 and 4, and then took over as Dylan Taylor as the editor from issue 5 and 6 onwards. And so I'd also just like to, before I continue, just holler to Dylan Taylor, who many of you probably know, and he was just really instrumental in setting the journal up, and it's kind of very much from the fruits of his labour that the journal's come. And lastly, as a kind of disclaimer before I continue, so in this, what I'll be talking about today is kind of from my experience as working with the journal and kind of my own thoughts about it, so it's not kind of reflective or representative of the wider editorial board necessarily, who, while sharing a commitment to kind of egalitarian politics, I wouldn't want to presume to represent. And so one element of my own political views that kind of inflects what I want to talk about today is the desire to, I guess, take the communist project seriously. And as communism is a kind of fraught word, I thought I'd just quickly clarify what I mean when I use it here. I'm sure that I might get taken to task with this later on. But for me, communism refers, and this is kind of influenced by kind of Alain Badiou's ideas on communism. For me, communism refers to the idea of radical equality between human beings, and to the historical movement that has sought to realise a radically egalitarian society free from kind of oppressive and dominant structures. In this respect, I do not see communism as a kind of political project that articulates a kind of like blueprint for a future society as such. It's at least at this stage in its kind of history, it's the movement towards a kind of promise of radical egalitarianism and emancipation. Right, so that's definitely enough of a preamble. So the first point I wanted to make is that it's been frequently remarked upon in the last few years that the Western world, in particular after the 2008 financial crisis and the kind of ongoing economic and political fallout from that, is mired in what Gramsci called an interregnum. So a situation in which the presently existing order has ceased to be truly hegemonic, but no systemic alternative has yet been established. So interregnum in this way refers to a kind of intermediary period in which a crisis of hegemony kind of generates multiple morbid symptoms in the political, economic and cultural landscapes. So it is worth remembering here that real hegemony is achieved through a mix of consent and coercion. So neoliberalism, for instance, was a hegemonic project that, while pursued by the capitalist class and capitalist state in a period of kind of relative dominance, has nonetheless enjoyed broad-based support, at least for a period of a significant period of its history. There's been widespread buy-in by many sectors of the kind of voting public to neoliberal ideas and ideals, its promulgation in the cultural sphere, and its kind of reproduction as the dominant ideological atmosphere. But if consent to a hegemonic project such as that of neoliberalism significantly declines or evaporates altogether, hegemony can only be reproduced through coercive kind of actions from the state and the capitalist class. And this ultimately makes it kind of less stable and less effective. So neoliberalism, in my view, can be understood as a relatively coherent and functional hegemonic project, or accumulation regime, if you prefer, in the advanced economies throughout at least some of its history, namely the 1990s and early 2000s. Provided high rates of profit for capitalists, largely through disciplining labour. It ensured rising demand over the long term, largely through the provision of cheap and easy credit, and we see how this has been unwound recently. And it generated conditions conducive to long-term investment through a variety of kind of disciplining apparatus. This, however, is manifestly not the case today. Since at least the bursting of the US real estate bubble in 2006 and the kind of slide into recession and financial crisis that we saw in 2007 and 8, many advanced economies have kind of permanently stagnated and many working people have become far worse off. And the cycle of debt-funded consumption that neoliberalism largely ran on has become fundamentally unstable. And today, after the weak and fragile recovery of many advanced economies over this kind of the last decade, there is now kind of signs of this impending world economic slowdown that the IMF and OECD are now writing about, suggesting that even with a very weak recovery, the economy is about to be, or the kind of global economy is about to be plunged into another recession. So in many ways, this is kind of suggestive of the fact that neoliberalism as both an ideology and accumulation regime has run out of answers. And this has given way to widespread ideological, cultural, kind of political and economic disruption. So I know I'm moving quite fast here, but I'm just kind of like, this is just a gloss to, I guess, my kind of mode of conceptualizing left-wing publishing. So despite this kind of decline in neoliberal hegemony, no kind of new hegemonic project has yet kind of arisen to replace neoliberalism. And so to summarise using Gramsci's well-known formulation, we can say that the current crisis, consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And for the left, this appears to be good news. After decades of relative retreat, reactive actions, kind of infighting and fracturing, the left has been presented with the opportunity to go on the offensive for, I think, the first time in a couple of decades, and possibly win significant gains in the broader struggle for hegemony. And we've seen, this kind of unfolding over the last decade. However, as Gramsci emphasised, a period of interregnum is by no means guarantees that there will be political economic transformation in the direction those of us on the left might desire. So to quote Gramsci again, it may be ruled out that immediate economic crises of themselves produce fundamental historical events. They can simply create a terrain more favourable to the dissemination of certain modes of thought and certain ways of posing and resolving questions. So in this respect, the unstable terrain of the present has also created favourable conditions for even more radical libertarian capitalists, for fascists and authoritarians, as we've seen, and less frighteningly, must be said, for social democrats. So it is then a moment of heightened danger for the communist left, not just one of opportunity, and I think that's an important thing to take seriously. And the outcome will not be determined. The outcome will be determined by which political formations can kind of secure hegemony over the coming decades. So the first point I want to make is simply that while the present interregnum provides the left with significant opportunities and calls for kind of invigoration and excitement, transformation in a progressive direction is not necessarily assured or even all that likely. And to this, I think we should add that systemic transformation away from neoliberalism will take many decades, as neoliberal forms of power are deeply entrenched. So while transition away from capitalism altogether could take, transition away from capitalism altogether could take, decades longer. Cool. Okay. So the second point, to move on to the second point. So if we are to agree, which I'm asking you to agree with me, that capitalist power is firmly entrenched, systemic change will need to be enormous in scale and therefore time-consuming, and victory on the left or for the left is not assured in any way, then it is important that the left sets about building counter-hegemonic infrastructure. Which is to say, it is important that the left puts part of its energies into the development of institutions and modes of thinking that take a long-term view of the communist struggle and that seek to build hegemony over the long term. And this position, of course, is one shared by many people across the left, and I'm sure no news to any of you here. So in this respect, while the present moment bears witness to a resurgence of the left, it is important to remember that the left is also emerging out of a long period of defeat, a period that has seen the hollowing out of leftist institutions and infrastructure. And so as such, a great deal of the work to be done is essentially rebuilding what we have lost. So what is needed in this respect, in my view, is a broad-based expansion and solidification of leftist institutions and organisations of various forms: political parties, workers' advocacy groups, educational institutions, think tanks, single-issue activist groups, and so on. And these institutions or organisations can be thought of as kind of singular elements in the development of a wider counter-hegemonic infrastructure. So one task in the present moment is to rebuild some of the infrastructure that used to make the left a formidable entity, and doing so, of course, in line with the political progress that has been made over the kind of last 3 or 4 decades in kind of decolonial, anti-racist, feminist, queer and environmental politics, and learning from the mistakes of the past as well. And so there's, of course, many encouraging moves made in this respect in Aotearoa, New Zealand, including the development of ESRA, the formation of organisation Aotearoa, the formation of groups such as People Against Prisons Aotearoa, to name a few. And so left publishing, of course, is one area that I think can contribute to the development of this kind of counter-hegemonic infrastructure. Indeed, I think it is a crucial space in which this kind of infrastructure, or a crucial addition to this infrastructure, as it can play important mediatory and connective roles between the various left institutions, organisations, groups and people. So specifically, I think there's 5 main roles that leftist publishing can play, and ideally should play, in its capacity as a kind of element in a wider counter-hegemonic infrastructure. And so I want to kind of run through the first 4 relatively briefly, and then spend a little longer talking about the 5th. So firstly, left publications, particularly if they are independent, by which I mean not actively affiliated with a particular party or adhering to a strict ideological line, are spaces in which the present can be cognitively mapped. That is, they are platforms through which a kind of array of perspectives on the political, cultural, economic and ideological coordinates of the present can be elucidated. They are spaces in which we can render intelligible where we have been and where we are today. Second, left publications can provide spaces in which communist strategy can be discussed and critiqued in detail. And this includes, to my mind, the thinking through and debating of short, medium and long-term strategy, as well as more immediate tactical discussions and debates. Having the capacity to think through and articulate strategy is particularly important, for instance, in activist communities who, facing time and resource constraints, are often unable to develop such resources purely because they're engaged in kind of immediate action that needs to happen. So to avoid a perpetually kind of short-termist and reaction-oriented politics, the left needs to cultivate such resources. Third, left publications contribute, like other counter-hegemonic infrastructure, to the construction of a wider horizon of political possibility. Something that involves the articulation of desires and programs, both detailed and sketchy, for alternative futures. I think this is crucial in the development of a wider hegemonic project and vision. Taking seriously people's desires for a better world and sharing these amongst each other both reminds people that another world is possible and informs us as to the direction in which left political struggle should be oriented. So fourth, left publications can provide, or potentially provide, spaces in which internal critique between those on the left is conducted and new forms potentially discovered. So to use Chantal Mouffe's terminology, I think the left needs to continue to strive towards or find ways of transforming the kind of multiple antagonisms that cut through our various strands and groups into productive forms of agonism. A part of this, no doubt, is the construction of a mutually shared language and mutually shared forms of debate. In this, left publications, in my view, can act as potential spaces for thinking through and actually practicing this kind of difficult but inevitable task. So ideally, to my mind, if understood as elements of a kind of wider counter-hegemonic infrastructure, left publications can do all of the above in a kind of institutional manner, by which I mean they can kind of take a form that endures over time and potentially through changes in personnel and be a kind of a resource that is, that can be kind of tapped by successive generations, potentially. Which is not to say that sometimes a publication can flare up for 1 or 2 years and have a great impact. Cool, so the third point I wanted to make is around the 5th role that I think left publishing can fulfill, is that the acts, and this is, the acts of writing and reading and by extension publishing are means of connecting the fabrics of communist struggle across space and across peoples, but also across time. And so this, in my view, is a kind of an important aspect in challenging and dismantling so-called capitalist realism. So the idea of capitalist realism, while in some respects articulating an ideological injunction that there is no alternative, and in other respects articulating the kind of ontological experience in which capitalist forms of sociality are naturalised, also articulates a particular approach to history. And by this I am referring to the manner in which bourgeois historiography kind of emphasises the supposedly inexorable march, or forward march, of capitalist progress. In bourgeois historiography, the communist movement as a challenge to capitalism was essentially abolished in the late 20th century. The story was a linear one that has now come to an end. And against this linear reading of the communist movement, figures such as Badiou have argued that communism is, rather an ever-present and kind of potentially accessible idea, one that emerges materially at different historical junctures, asserting and evidencing that a new world is possible. And so, a useful way of conceptualising this idea, I think, that I kind of recently chanced across is in Michel Filippini's rereading of Gramsci, which is a recent rereading of Gramsci. And Filippini suggests that two approaches to time can be found in Gramsci's work: bourgeois time and epochal time. The first, bourgeois time, refers to the mundane, linear progression of bourgeois history in which capitalism progresses through its various and inevitable crises. And this is what Gramsci termed passive revolution. Essentially, the progression of capitalism from one mode of articulation to another. Bourgeois time, therefore, essentially consists of the linear reproduction over time of capitalism as such. Thus, in bourgeois historiography, time moves linearly and follows the same essential path. Such a conception of history, however, obfuscates the alternative temporalities that exist within and beyond bourgeois time. In contrast to bourgeois time, we have epochal time. Epochal time is that which breaks with the linearity of bourgeois time and constructs history along a different set of coordinates. Essentially, epochal time is that which has existed in the past, yet which is always accessible in the present. So to quote Filippini, epochal time is history that sees a subject refer to fragments of the past in order to break the continuity of bourgeois time, or, in other words, that breaks the linear and seemingly inexorable process of passive revolution. Sorry, that was actually a half Filippini's quote and half my own words. If we can think of bourgeois historiography as the process of adding together linearly unfolding events that signify the passive revolution of capitalism, epochal history is the historiography of the interruptions to this process. So in this sense, the history of communism, and the capacity that I've been using it here, is one that moves through epochal time. Communist history has the ever-present capacity to be pulled out of the past and brought into the fabric of the present, breaking for a time the linear temporality of life under capitalism and filling up the present with the energy of the past, of the communist past. To quote Filippini again, in such a reading, historical time is that in which the present recalls fragments of the past in order to redeem and revive them. The link between two moments in time thus disrupts the linearity of bourgeois time and reveals a different movement. And this construction of an alternative temporality is a task that must be accomplished by revolutionary subjects, or communist militants, if you prefer. As Filippini writes again, it is up to the revolutionary subject that wishes to establish hegemony to be able to reconnect with those moments in history that have expressed such intensity, and to bring the contemporaneity those attempts made to overturn the old system in order to create a new one. So with this idea of epochal history in mind, which is admittedly a kind of sketchy outlay of it, and I'm welcome critique or kind of comments on that, is my third point is simply that writing and reading, and this can seem maybe a mundane point, but it is that it's a means through which those committed to communist struggle in the present can be connected in some way, both to the struggle's historical arc and through a publication's capacity to act as an artefact that endures through time to its future. Left publications, then, in addition to the other four roles that I briefly outlined, have the capacity to render intelligible for communist militants, or latent communist militants, the wider historical movement of which they are a part. So one potential role of left publishing as an element of a wider counter-hegemonic infrastructure is to help historicise the communist movement, to bring the communist past into the present, and to emphasise the endurance of communism over time. And I think that's a really important thing. So after these kind of propositions, what in my view is the place of independent left publishing in contemporary Aotearoa, New Zealand? Firstly, I think it's worth noting that there was once a really flourishing and diverse left press here, spanning the middle and late 20th century, and it was kind of its most established period in the middle and late 20th century, which of course coincides with a kind of period of relative strength of Labour. But this press has kind of largely died out by the early 21st century and is still very limited. So independent left periodicals over this time included the New Zealand wing of Monthly Review, which ran from 1960 to 1966, the Republican, which followed a similar time period, Race, Gender and Class, the New Zealand Political Review, and there are also politicals of a more kind of partisan nature, such as the Socialist Action League, Socialist Action, the Communist Party of New Zealand's People's Voice, the Workers' Communist League's Unity, and all these ran over this for greater or lesser lengths over this time period, and a number of publications from the Socialist Unity Party, as well as periodicals from feminists, the LGBTQ plus movement, and numerous trade union publications. So it was like a really lively scene. And the number of readers of some of these publications was, to my mind, and I think by contemporary numbers, pretty impressive. So according to Toby Borroman, who did a history of the left press here in the first issue of Counterfutures, New Zealand Monthly Review at its peak had over 2,000 subscribers, while some of the newspapers regularly sold thousands of units per issue. So with this kind of history of active left publications and a kind of a captive readership, it is imperative, in my view, that more enduring publications are established in the near future. In this respect, particularly absent, in my view, are kind of regular communist news and education sources, particularly for broader audiences. I think we really need publications that speak directly from, with and to workers and marginalised communities, and publications that fulfil kind of educational and mobilising and connective roles and are unashamed in that capacity. An important element of this, I think, is a kind of to put an emphasis on enabling the ideas and knowledge of organic intellectuals and these communities to be widely propagated and disseminated. And this kind of raises the question of medium and what the kind of what the most appropriate way to kind of reinvigorate the left press is. It doesn't have to be in print, but in this I kind of would welcome discussion, because I'm not so sure of what the best way forward is. Print media, while having a kind of resurgence of sorts lately, that is largely kind of confined to the cultural elite, is still largely in decline. Online media, while having certain advantages, is kind of subject to filtering algorithms, intense competition for attention. Podcasts and videos seem promising as alternative sources of kind of publication and news, but at the end of the day I don't really have suggestions into this respect, and being kind of old-fashioned and bookish myself, my own contribution will remain print-focused, I think. I'll skip that bit. So I'm also aware that kind of the development of publications face, pressing resource constraints. So writing and editing takes a huge amount of time, as everyone in this room probably knows, and publishing and distribution have, costs. So in Counterfutures' experience, we've been kind of able to navigate some of those issues by situating the journal in the university context and drawing on the labour of academics who tend to be well paid, and to do the kind of producing and editing work, and then be able to tap the resources of the university, which is such mundane things as postage, but also access to databases and computers, which is super important. At the end of the day, still, even with all these resources, it requires many hours of unpaid labour to get these publications together. So I think while also having no solutions to this issue of resource constraint, one thing that I would suggest is that existing counter-hegemonic organisations look to tap their already existing and no doubt already stretched resources in the development of a left press, and to use the institutions of the university where possible. With Aotearoa, New Zealand, a small country, and the communist left not particularly wealthy, I think it will be important that resources and capacities are pooled in the future. So while it's important that more publications are started, I think it's also would be counterproductive if too many different ones emerge from too many different kind of angles, as their days will likely be numbered. And this kind of speaks to, I guess, the issue of resisting factionalisation, which in my view is also paramount to the long-term viability of these projects. And this is not to say that I think diverse groups on the left should consolidate into some lumbering and unwieldy kind of middle-of-the-road type organisation, or that internal criticism and outright, fights should be avoided, but rather to say that we need to genuinely try and construct spaces that can act as connective platforms between the kind of like diverse and often antagonistic groups on the left, and try and find kind of mutually shared forms of communication and critique. I think it is also crucial that in the development of the left press in Aotearoa, that it's crucial that the kind of knowledges of different sectors of the left are drawn out of their relative silos. So while there is a lot of crossover between activist and academic communities, for instance, we need more systematic approaches to sharing knowledge and expertise. So this is, in my view, a matter of providing people in the activist, social movement and union sector kind of left with resources necessary to write and publish in an often time-scarce environment. Likewise, it is crucial that we render academic work communicable to wider numbers of people, and this is not a matter of dumbing down academia, in my opinion, or abolishing existing modes of academic knowledge production, but it is to reiterate that if academics are serious about changing the world, then the knowledge produced inside the academy must necessarily be disseminated outside of it. And this is a matter of finding more effective communicative capacities, something that involves paying close attention to what people are responsive to and working hard to make sure one's own work is accessible in some way or other. So to conclude, I guess I would suggest that ultimately the greatest potential strength of left publications is that in their production and consumption they can work as spaces for communication among people on the left, as meeting places in which those who are interested in reactivating and pursuing a politics of radical equality can communicate with one another, build links, strengthen their own critique and praxis, and improve others. And left publishing can be another mode of building strategic and effective links with one another in the years ahead. So in this way, I think that left publications ultimately, like other kind of counter-hegemonic infrastructure, have the potential to be meeting places where people who desire another and a better world can find each other. That's me. Thanks.